and I'm the Executive Director with NASCAST. And before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please ask the question using the chat option on the webinar tool. This toolbar is on the right side of your screen. You'll see a text box where you can type in the question for the organizer host and all participants. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording and link to the PowerPoint will be made publicly available on the NASCAST website after the webinar is over. Today's webinar will be led by the Federal Office of Community Services and facilitated by NASCAST. It's my honor to introduce Seth Hassett, who is the Director of the Division of State Assistance, DSA, within the Office of Community Services, OCS. Him and his staff have been hard at work at all these issues, and it's been a privilege of NASCAST to work with them on this. At this point, I'd like to turn over the mic to Seth.
Okay, thank you very much, Shanae, and thank you everyone for being with us for this second webinar in this series. We had a very productive conversation yesterday and received a lot of good input from our first session. Today we're moving to some very important sections of the Model State Plan, focusing on organizational standards, the state use of funds, training and technical assistance, and linkages and communications. And these are all very important parts of both our accountability measures and our understanding of state plans and activities. So what I would like to do is hand over to Jana Holden, who will orient you to where we're heading in this session.
Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. As we move into the second session, as Seth mentioned, we'll be going through the content overview of sections 6 through 9. And as you participate in this webinar, just as a reminder, a few things will be helpful for you to have in front of you as listed here. Really important for you to have a copy of the Model State Plan as well as your state accountability measures handy. So as we go through the slides, we can reference those documents. And it's also very helpful to have a copy of the CSBG Act. For any of you who have joined us today that might have missed yesterday's webinar, we really encourage you to go back and listen to that because there's a lot of helpful background information on the entire effort. It includes an overview of the performance management framework, our state plan vision. We gave a preview of OLDC, as well as talked about and previewed some of the things that we'll be discussing at the upcoming NASCAST conference. So we really encourage you to go back to NASCAST's website where they will have that posted and take a look at that if you're joining us for the first time. We're going to try to bring everybody up to speed fairly quickly as we go through the webinar. And as we move into the next slide, you'll notice that there's a chart here that crosswalks the state accountability measures with the various sections of the Model State Plan. So you can see the exact place in the Model State Plan or the exact question that will tie into the accountability measures. So this will be helpful as you walk through the plan as we go through the webinar today to kind of identify where those accountability measures will come up throughout the plan. I will now turn this presentation over to Liza Lowe, who's going to take us through an overview of the content.
Thanks, Jana. Good afternoon, everybody. We are now up to Section 6. As Jana and Seth mentioned, we covered Sections 1 through 5 yesterday. And Section 6 is an important section because it's about organizational standards. These are the standards as described in IM 138 that we published on January 26th, just last month. And we all remember from those of us who were on the webinar yesterday that Jeannie gave us a really great overview of performance management and accountability, the framework we're implementing for CSBG, and of course the organizational standards for eligible entities is a critical component of this framework. So this section is devoted to organizational standards, and the purpose is to describe state state decisions and procedures about organizational standards. Remember, these standards are for the eligible entities and not for the states, but the states have a big role in implementing these. So the model state plan in this section describes these state decisions that include the choice of standards that the state will make, and the choice is either for the Center of Excellence developed standards as described in IM 138 or an alternative set of standards. Also in this section, the state will also describe the state-level implementation process for the standards, which is the means or mechanism by which the state will implement the standards across the state. Options might be implementing the standards through regulation, through policy, through contract, or other means. And you will see that when we look at the model state plan in a minute, how that's delineated. In addition, the purpose of this section is for the state to describe the procedures and approach the state will use to assess eligible entities against the standards, such as peer-to-peer review, self-assessment, et cetera. And the model state plan describes some options there. Finally, in this section, the state may also describe any special circumstances for eligible entities that may be accepted from being assessed against standards. So this is a special exception. Now, please consult IM 138 if you have questions about special circumstances, exceptions, implementation procedures, etc. We know the IM is recently out, and states and eligible entities are still processing that guidance. For our purpose today regarding the model state plan, we don't want to go into a lot of detail or much detail about the standards themselves. What we're talking about here is how the model state plan will incorporate and what aspects they'll incorporate of the organizational standards in the state model state plan. Our approach in the model state plan is to design a minimal number of questions that give us all the critical and targeted information about how the organizational standards will be implemented and assessed in each state. We have tried to automate answers with checkboxes as much as possible, but we do encourage states to provide narrative or documentation in addition to what may be required and requested in the model state plan as needed. And we encourage you to please go through the questions in this section very carefully as you review the model state plan, and we really welcome your feedback and comments. Let's take a moment, if you do have your model state plan in front of you, and we thank NASCAS for providing those links to some of the documents we need for today. Section 6 is on page 9 of the model state plan, and you'll see what we're talking about in terms of check boxes there and types of responses that we can have. So do look at this carefully. Some of them are yes-no answers. We hope that's easy. You'll also see that, for example, if you as a state decide not to adopt the Center of Excellence organizational standards, you will be expected to provide documentation to back up your alternative set of standards. So that would be maybe a couple extra steps, and you'd be able to attach those supporting documents right into this section. Of course, if you just choose the Center of Excellence standards, it's a checkbox. So we hope to make this as easy as possible. You will see on the slide here that there's actually only one accountability measure in this section. However, looking at the accountability measures document that hopefully you have in front of you, the state accountability measures, you can see that there are several accountability measures on organizational standards. It turns out that the other measures on standards fit better in other sections of the model state plan, so they're not all in section 6, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's look at the one measure that is in this section of the model state plan. For those who may have missed the webinar yesterday, we are laying out each accountability measure in the section in which that accountability measure is associated. And you may recall the slide that Jana just showed at the top of the webinar that made that crosswalk so that you can see where the accountability measures sort of fit into the model state plan right now. So take a look at your accountability measures as we go, and let's first look at measure 6SA. And this is a measure under, as we noted, under the heading of organizational standards for eligible entities in your accountability measure document. And it reads, as it says on the slide, during the performance period, X% of assessed eligible entities in the state met the state-adopted organizational standards. Now, as noted in IM 138, the goal is for all eligible entities to meet 100% of the standards. This measure helps us, this accountability measure then will help us see where we are in relation to that 100% goal. In the measure here, you'll see the X%. That X% means the state will establish a baseline percentage in the first year. And if the percentage is less than 100%, the state will set targets for improvement in subsequent years. So that's what that means in the accountability measure here. Now, let's take a look at the corresponding question in the model state plan, which is, you'll see on the slide, is question 6.7, and I'm turning to it now, and it reads, target. What percentage of assessed eligible entities in the state does the state expect will meet the state-adopted organizational standards in the next year? And you'd put a percentage. Actually, you'll see as you compare the accountability measure to the question here under 6.7 that they're slightly different. They're not the same. They're not exactly mirroring each other. That is because the model state plan question sets a target percentage. That's what we're doing in the plan, but assessing how the eligible entity did, the eligible entities in the state did on the actual accountability measure, how many eligible entities met the organizational standards, that is assessed in the annual report. So you see how the accountability measure and the model state plan interact with each other, but in terms of getting the data on accountability measure 6SA, you will do that in the annual report, and you'll see on the slide here it says point of assessment in the annual report. And as a reminder about how to read the model state plan, as you review, for every question that is associated with an accountability measure, you will see a note in parentheses directly under the question that references the accountability measure. This is just a way to help you make the linkages as you go through the plan. And again, you also have that crosswalk slide at the beginning of the webinar that does the same thing. We just want to indicate the association. As mentioned earlier, and as you can see on your accountability measures document, there is a whole section of accountability measures on organizational standards. The fact that, by the way, that the accountability measures for organizational standards happen to be number 6, and that corresponds with the section 6 in the model state plan, is actually a coincidence, but is helpful. Only one measure, 6SA, is associated directly with section 6 in the model state plan, and the other organizational standards accountability measures are in other appropriate spots in the plan. For example, if you're looking at your measures under section 6, 6SB(i) on technical assistance plans for eligible entities with unmet standards will be in section 8 about state technical assistance and training. So we'll see that in a minute. So this concludes our overview of section 6. And at this point, before we go on, we'll go on in a moment to section 7. But we do want to remind you all to jot down your questions, type them into the chat box if you have the opportunity to do that now. And do take a minute now or later to go through everything very carefully in this section. Now we're going to move on to section 7, which is on state use of funds. This is a longer section. So for the sake of our presentation today, we've broken it out into 3 topic areas featured on this slide. There's the topic of use of funds of the 90% funds, use of the administrative funds, and use of the remainder or discretionary funds. These categories are the state's 3 allowable uses for CSBG funds. And a quick note on terminology. We have tried to use the terms of the CSBG Act here, particularly Section 675C, uses of funds. Now, other places in the Act and also in common use, we often use the term discretionary to mean the funds the state has for additional activities. However, we wanted to also pair that with the statutory term remainder along with discretionary, because that is the way the statute reads. The way the statute sets it up is that the state may use no less than 90% funds to pass along to the eligible entities, and then after the state sets aside an allowable amount of administrative funds, the remaining funds may be used for discretionary activities. So that's the terminology we have here, and please make any comment on that at any time. The first subsection under 7 is the use of 90% funds. These are the funds, of course, that the state passes on to the eligible entities and are to be not less than 90% of the funds made available to the state. The purpose of this section is to collect information on the state's distribution formula, which is based on the categories from you may be familiar with in the IS report. In this section, we also want to collect information on the state's expected or planned allocations to each eligible entity. And finally, we'd like to collect information on the distribution of funds, including the state processing time and timeframes. Now, first, I want to point out, if you want to turn to your model state plan to section 7, and this is on page 11, I'd like to point out the allocation table for 90% funds under item 7.2 of the model state plan. The state's list of eligible entities will pre-populate into the table from the list of eligible entities that was entered into the state plan under section 5. Also, there's flexibility in this table to enter data for 1-year or 2-year plans as appropriate to this choice in your state. And since we do understand that this is just a planned allocation and the state does not yet have real numbers to use at the point when you're submitting your state plan or developing your state plan, we've tried to build into this table an option for indicating planned funds in either dollars or percentages of dollars. Although I believe we're thinking about picking one approach, either dollars or percentages, in the final version, and that will depend on comments we receive. So if you do have a comment about what would work better, please let us know. The data in this table will pre-populate then in the annual report so that after the performance period, the state will be able to enter then the actual or true allocations of funds that went to the entities. Now, this information is based on Section A of the IS report, which asks for both planned and actual fund expenditures after the end of the performance period. Here, we are asking for the planned amounts up front. And just to note, it is not the expectation that planned and actual allocations match up perfectly in the annual report. We know that that would be probably difficult at best. So we want your best guess or your best plan of what you'd like to do with the funds. And then at the other end, when you write your actual, you can provide an explanation of what, how those matched up and explain a comparison between the two. Now, there are 2 accountability measures in this section. One is associated with what we are calling a performance management questions in the model state plan. And if you missed yesterday's webinar, you can go back, and it might take a moment to review the overview slides on these types of questions, although we'll go over it here as well. The first accountability measure in this section is 2SA, which is under the heading on your accountability measures document of distribution of funds. And it reads, During the performance period, the state made funds available to eligible entities within 30 calendar days after federal and state authority was provided. You will note that the measure looks at time starting after the CSBG office has gotten both federal and state authority. So that's when the clock starts ticking, and that you're to distribute the funds hopefully by 30 calendar days. Now let's look at the corresponding question to this measure in the model state plan, and that is question 7.5. This reads, distribution time frame after state authority. After getting state authority, which we assume is after you've already gotten federal authority, the state expects to make funds available to eligible entities within how many calendar days? And then there's options for drop-down choices. And we have 1 to 14 days, 15 to 30 days, and then over 30 days, and also varies. And there'll be probably an opportunity to add more to that if you want to describe it. But you would choose the drop-down box, and obviously if you're trying to make that accountability measure, you would want to choose a selection that would be before that 30-day calendar, those 30 calendar days. As you can see, this, let's see. The corresponding question in the model state plan is simply asked what the expected distribution time frame is in the state after both federal and state authority is granted. In addition, in question 7.5a, which is just below that in the model state plan, the state provides information about the state's process for getting authority. And that question says, please explain the process for making funds available after getting state authority. Take into account the time frame that the state specifies under item 7.5, that's that window before 30 days. Also include information about agency approval, contractual procedures, etc. Collecting this kind of information about the process in the state can alert the state and OCS to any challenges the state may face in this area. The state's performance against this measure, meeting the 60 calendar day time frame after both federal and state authority, will be assessed in the annual report. And you'll see on the slide it says point of assessment, the annual report. So in the model state plan, you'll be saying your target, we hope to distribute the funds at this time frame. And then you'll be able to actually give us the actual performance on that time frame in the annual report. And that's where the accountability measure, you'll be able to assess whether you met that 30 calendar days. Now let's take a look at the accountability measure, the next one, 2SB, that's associated with a performance management question in this section. 2SB is also about distribution of funds, and it reads, during the performance period, using data from a nationally administered survey of eligible entities and feedback from OCS and other sources, the state adjusted its plan in the next state plan submission as appropriate to improve the quality of grant administration. For those who may have missed the webinar yesterday, these accountability measures, the performance management questions, are measuring whether the state gathered feedback in a performance area and then use that information to improve performance in the next go-round as appropriate. In this case, the performance area is improving the quality of grant administration. The measure wants to know if the state may have used data to make improvements in this area. The data sources would include the survey based on the ACSI methodology, which we touched upon yesterday and will describe more at NASCASP. But there may be other sources of feedback too. Those are all your data sources. Now to bring this together a little more, let's read the corresponding performance management question, which is in the model state plan, which is 7.6. It reads, performance management adjustment. How is the state improving grant administration, that's the performance area again, grant administration procedures under this state plan as compared to past plans? Any improvements should be based on analysis of past performance and should consider feedback from eligible entities, OCS, and other sources. If the state is not making any improvements, please explain, and that's certainly an option. Again, you won't answer this question the first time you fill out the model state plan, and you can see that instruction that's directly above 7.6. If this is the first year filling out the plan, you can skip that question. But the next time you submit a plan, you will fill out this performance management adjustment question. It's at that point in the next model state plan that the state and OCS can assess how the state performed on this measure. So you can see point of assessment is indeed on the next model state plan. So now we'll move on to the second topic that's under Section 7, use of funds, and this is use of administrative funds. This topic is fairly straightforward. It features only 3 short questions and no accountability measures. And you can see the heading on page 12, right above 7.7, and then it goes through 7.9. The purpose of these questions is to collect information on the planned amount of CSBG funds for state administrative purposes and the use of CSBG funds for state personnel. You will recognize all of these questions in some form from the IS report. Now we're moving on to the third and final topic under Section 7. This subsection is about the state use of remainder discretionary funds, and we have a little unpacking to do here. The overall purpose of this section is to collect information on planned allocation of remainder funds by statutory categories, including a brief activity description under each category, and also to collect information on the types of organizations receiving funds to carry out these activities. The main data collection mechanism in this section is a big table where the state can enter the planned funds. Again, right now we have a choice of either dollars or percentages of dollars. And the state will indicate allocations by allowable use categories. There are some extensive instructions for this table, as you can see, so please take a good look at it when you're reviewing. There are 2 accountability measures in this section, including a measure associated with a performance management question in the model state plan. Now, before we go through the accountability measures in this section, however, we have a couple of slides to describe what we're trying to achieve with this section, especially in the table. The use of remainder discretionary funds is one of those areas in the former state plan where there was a great deal of overlap and some redundancy because this topic interacts with other areas in the state plan, such as program assurances and other topics. So our goal in this section in creating this remainder discretionary fund section and the table was to have the state only enter data in one place and allow the data to link or pre-populate to other corresponding areas. We really do welcome your comments on this section, and especially automation comments. It's awkward to try to convey this table in some way, so on paper in this document, so please do provide your comments on this. On the next slide, you'll see the remainder discretionary categories listed out. And these are allowable, these are the categories that are the allowable uses of funds according to the CSBG Act, and I just wanted to delineate these. It's 675C, little b1, is where you will find this list. So the list may not be familiar to everybody, and it may not necessarily resonate with everybody. Hopefully it does, but that's where the list is from. It's straight from the statute, so we didn't create any of these categories, but we're trying to align even more closely with use of funds and what's allowed under the statute. Now here you'll see on this slide and in the model state plan, we've listed them in a slightly shorter form. So we encourage you to read the statute for the full meaning of the activity, and please let us know if you think we've translated or shortened the activity description in an incorrect way, or if you have other suggestions for making it better and clearer on our table. So the state may use only, this indicates the state may only use remainder discretionary funds for these purposes. However, you can see that this actually is pretty broad because considering purpose H is other activities that are consistent with the law. So you actually have a lot of flexibility with these funds, but we are asking that we lay it out in, and you allocate funds according to allowable uses. And some of these may jump out at you more directly. For example, the first one is very familiar to everybody, and in fact, it's so important that we have its own section for training and technical assistance, and there you see the issue with overlap. We've got overlap training and technical assistance funds used here, and then we'll have another section in training and technical assistance. So that's just a precursor to our discussion about how we tried to make this simpler. The next slide discusses our approach, and as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to reduce overlap and repetition, and the table under 7.10 of the Model State Plan doesn't just require, you'll note, doesn't just require the planned allocation of funds, it also requires a short description of the activities you'll see in that far right column. And why, you might ask, are we requiring a high-level description for activities and services here? And the reason is to fulfill the program assurance that's over in section 14 at the very end of this Model State Plan is our list of program assurances. And there is one program assurance, 676B2, that requires the state to describe the use of discretionary funds. So not only, we want you to lay out the allocations for discretionary uses, but later you're also going to have to describe the actual uses, what the activities are. So we were hoping to combine those two requirements into one table. And I wrote here, the state plan requirement in the Act says that the state plan shall contain such information as the Secretary shall require, including these program assurances, including 676B2. So the assurance is written here on the slide, so you can read that if you want to be familiar with it. And again, it's just saying that the state is required to describe how they're using discretionary funds. Now, if the state is not using remainder discretionary funds for a certain category or of activity, A through H, and you would put $0 next to one of these remainder fund uses categories, then a description is not necessarily required for the most part, right? If you're not using any funds for training and technical assistance, you wouldn't need to describe it. However, if there is money allocated, the state must then describe that activity. Now, there's further discussion about how we're cross-referencing and crosswalking this table. As we noted earlier, there's overlap also with other sections of the plan, such as training and technical assistance. So if we have the training and technical assistance plans, your activities you want to do under there all laid out in section 8 of the plan, we don't want you to duplicate that in the table here. So you will see if you look on the Model State Plan under the table 7.10A, training and technical assistance, it says on the far right that description field is not fillable because it's a cross-reference to 8.1. So if you were coming into this, you would say, we're going to do X amount of dollars for training and technical assistance, and all you'd have to do in the table is enter your dollar amounts, and then you'd be done with this section. And then later, when you fill out section 8, that fulfills the requirement of providing a description. So that's a lot of detail. And let me just move on to the next slide here to show you the crosswalk of table 7.10. We tried to do this in the instructions in the Model State Plan, but I thought we'd offer another slide just to show you how this is working. Now, 7.10 is use of funds, so under all of these activity areas, A through H, you can allocate funding use, but in terms of when you have to provide a description, there's some that will crosswalk with other sections of the plan, and those are the first three. A, B, and C will crosswalk with other sections of the plan. Therefore, you would not have to fill out narrative here to describe how you're using those funds, because that's what you do in other sections of the plan. So only for D, E, G, H, and F, of course, do you need to provide this narrative. State charity tax credits, I understand not a lot of states do that, so you probably put $0 there, and you might not have anything in the narrative there because you've done $0. However, if you put some money towards that, you'd want to provide a brief narrative. It's possible that the table is a bit awkward to demonstrate this in the model state plan, and there may be opportunities for automation to make this clearer. But again, just to reiterate that we are trying to prevent you duplicating your effort and to link the parts of the plan to each other that make sense. So now I hope you'll look at that and think about that as you read through the model state plan, section 7. But let's move on to the accountability measure in this subsection. You will see that the accountability measure in this section is 3SA, which is under the heading of use of remainder discretionary funds, which is appropriate. And this accountability measure reads, during the performance period, the state used its discretionary funds in accordance with the strategy and dollars percentages outlined in the state plan. So as we've discussed, the corresponding question in the model state plan is 7.10, which is the table of allocations by categories and descriptions that we've been discussing. So that is your plan. This is how you are telling us and you your plan for how you're allocating your dollars. You hope to allocate your dollars for discretionary activities. Now, similar to the table for planned allocation of 90% funds, these discretionary remainder funds will indicate how the state plans to use the funds, and then in the annual report, the state will tell us how they performed in an actual performance in the use of these funds at the end of the performance period. And when you have those side by side, it will be easy for the state and OCS to compare planned performance use of funds against actual performance use of funds. Again, as we noted under the 90% fund section, it is not the expectation that planned and actual allocations match up perfectly in the annual report. If and when they don't match up perfectly, the state simply can provide an explanation. Again, the state's performance against the accountability measure here, which is a comparison of planned allocation activities against actual performance, will be assessed at the point of the annual report. That's the assessment point. Finally, in section 7, let's take a look at the accountability measure 3SB that is associated with the second performance management question in this section and the fourth question that we've covered so far. And let's read this. 3SB is also about distribution of funds, and it reads, during the performance period, using data from a nationally administered survey of eligible entities, the feedback from OCS and other sources, the state adjusted its plan in the next state plan as appropriate to improve its use of remainder discretionary funds. So in this case, the performance area that we're measuring and looking at is improving the use of remainder discretionary funds. Again, these accountability measures, these performance measures, are measuring whether the state gathered feedback in a specific performance area, in this case, the use of remainder discretionary funds, and then use that information to improve performance in the next go-around and as appropriate. The blue portion of the slide is just highlighting the performance area because, as we discussed before, the rest of the measure reads the same, and the black parts of the measure, the words, read the same as all of the other performance management questions. They're all identical except for pulling out the one, the performance area itself, which in this case is use of remainder funds. Now, we won't do this every time, but just as the last time perhaps, let's look at 7.12 in the model state plan, and this is the corresponding performance management question and we'll read this so you can see how they relate. Again, performance management adjustment. How is the state adjusting the use of remainder discretionary funds under this state plan as compared to the past plans? Any adjustment should be based on the state's analysis of past performance and should consider feedback from eligible entities, OCS, and other sources. If the state is not making adjustments, please explain. And you'll see how under here, it again references the accountability measure that is associated with 3SB. Again, you won't answer this question the first time you fill out the model state plan, but the next time you submit a plan, you will. This gives you a chance to have 1 year of feedback data before you tackle the issue of how you're going to adjust the plan and answer this question 7.12. And at that point, after you submit the next model state plan, that will be the point where the state and OCS can assess how the state performed on this accountability measure. So we've come to the conclusion of this second section, section 7 today. So again, we're just taking a brief pause to jot down any questions you have or send anything in the chat so that we can have those questions and begin to look at them as we go through the webinar. Again, we're taking questions at the end, but please submit them now. Now let's talk about Section 8 of the Model State Plan. This section is titled State Training and Technical Assistance Plan and is relatively short compared to Section 7 and 9 coming up. However, it captures some very important information and references 3 accountability measures, including a performance management measure. The purpose of this section is to gather information on plan training and technical assistance activities and on technical assistance plans, or TAPs, that are in place for eligible entities with unmet organizational standards. If you turn to this section, Section 8, you will see the main feature of this section is another table under item 8.1. And this is on page 16 of your document, your Model State Plan document. Now this table is pretty straightforward. It has 3 columns, one for a time frame, one for activity type, either training or technical assistance or both, and another column with a choice of general descriptive categories for the training and technical assistance. You can add as many rows as you like to the table. You'll see at the bottom it says add a row function. And you can make your plan and so you can fill out your plan for the coming performance period as you like. As you can see, the table can be used flexibly for a 1-year or a 2-year plan, since it allows you to select upcoming time frame of up to 8 quarters. That would be 2 years. This table will be your tool for planning these critical training and technical assistance activities in the upcoming performance period. This is a good time to take a moment to talk a little more about the interaction between the Model State Plan and the annual report. We touched on this yesterday, and we've been talking it all the way through, but we want to take a little pause to talk about how important this interaction is. The Model State Plan is the plan for CSBG in the state in the upcoming 1 or 2 years. The annual report, which in final form is still in the developmental stages here. We don't have a draft annual report quite yet, but that annual report will be the record of your actual performance and a place to reflect on your actual performance compared to what you had planned. In the annual report, for example, data from this training and technical assistance table that you will build under 8.1 of the Model State Plan will pre-populate data in the annual report. So you will be able, as you're going through your annual report, you'll be able to enter the actual data on your actual performance and then see your plan data and your actual data compared to each other and see how they relate. As we noted when we were discussing the tables for planned allocations of funds, the value isn't that you absolutely follow the plan to the letter and that the performance, the actual performance matches up entirely and closely to what you planned. The emphasis is not on that, it's on performance, not strictly following a plan. If suddenly, for example, there's a major training need that you didn't anticipate when you were making your plan way back when, you should make adjustments as appropriate and as you can to meet the need in the CSBG in the state. In the annual report then, if you did make an adjustment mid-year or do something different in reaction to a need, you would simply need to describe why you did that when you submit your actual performance in your annual plan. So we welcome any questions on that today in the webinar. The next couple of slides are on the accountability measures associated with Section 8. So let's read through them. The first measure is 3SC. If you look at your draft IM on the measures, you will see this measure is under the heading of Use of Remainder Discretionary Funds. And it reads, during the performance period, the state completed the training and technical assistance activities specified in its state plan. The corresponding question in the model state plan is obviously 8.1, which we were discussing. It's that table. And that table is indeed the plan for your upcoming performance period for the T and TA that you will provide. So this measure is pretty straightforward. The point of assessment for this measure will be in the annual report, where you can make a comparison between what the state planned to do, or planned performance in the area of training and technical assistance, and what the state actually did, or actual performance. Again, assessment of this measure will take into account any appropriate adjustments the state may have made to the plan due to any change in technical assistance and training during the performance period, and as you describe then in your annual report. The next measure is 6SB, and this may ring a bell because Section 6 for the accountability measures is under the heading of Organizational Standards for Eligible Entities. And it reads, during the performance period, the state had in place technical assistance plans, or TAPs, for all assessed eligible entities with unmet standards that could be resolved within 1 year. This question and the measure, you'll see, let's read the corresponding question in the model state plan, 8.2 is the corresponding question. Does the state have in place technical assistance plans for all assessed eligible entities with unmet organizational standards that could be resolved within 1 year? The question you'll see and the accountability measure, which we just read, they closely mirror one another. This is a very simple measure and a simple question. You will see that the answer choice in the model state plan for 8.2 is yes, no. So it will be easy to assess the accountability measure as being either met or unmet. Like the measures in the section on hearings, if you recall, and I think that's section 4 in the model state plan, this is really a point-in-time question and not so much a planning question. We are asking, are these TAPs in place now at the time of the submission? We're not asking for a plan. On the slide, however, you may note that the point of assessment is both the model state plan and the annual report, and this indicates that this question may be asked again in the annual report, as we expect the state to be putting TAPs in place continuously as the state assesses eligible entities against organizational standards and identifies unmet standards that could be resolved within 1 year. So again, this measure will be able to be assessed immediately in the model state plan, but the question will be asked again in the annual report, so it will be assessed at that point as well. The final accountability measure in Section 8 is associated with the 5th performance management question in the model state plan. This one is 3SD and is also under the heading of Remainder Discretionary Funds. And it reads, during the performance period, using data from a nationally administered survey of eligible entities and feedback from OCS and other sources, the state adjusted its plan in the next state plan submission as appropriate, to improve the training and technical assistance provided to the eligible entity. The performance area this measure is looking at, obviously, is training and technical assistance, since it's in this section, and it's the training and technical assistance provided to the eligible entity. Again, these accountability measures are measuring whether the state gathered feedback in a performance area, training and technical assistance in this case, and then use that information to improve performance in the next planning cycle as appropriate. Now, we've read through many of these questions now. Let me just draw your attention to the corresponding questions to this in the Model State Plan, and that's 8.3. And I'll let you look at it yourself. You can see the wording is identical to the other performance management questions, except it's focusing on the performance area of training and technical assistance, and is asking the state how the state adjusted their plans for training and technical assistance in the next state plan. Again, you won't answer this question the first time you fill out the Model State Plan, but the next time you submit a plan, you will, and this gives you a chance to have 1 year of feedback data before you tackle this question. And after you submit the next Model State Plan, the state and OCS can assess how the state performed on this measure. So we've gone through a couple of these performance management related measures and performance management Model State Plan questions. Let's take a moment to discuss a scenario in a little detail. Training and technical assistance is a somewhat tangible activity, so it's a good one to use. Let's say in year 1, this September 1st, 2015, you fill out and submit a 1-year Model State Plan and make a training and technical assistance plan under Section 8 that, for example, is focused heavily on general implementation of organizational standards, and you allocate your resources for several large webinar trainings. However, as the year progresses, you may hear feedback that rather than general training, for example, that eligible entities really need intensive training or technical assistance on certain organizational standards, and they need it focused. And you also learn that while the eligible entities appreciate the webinar format, some eligible entities prefer learning in person, and in fact, there might be other data, maybe from the state association, that other types of training may be more effective in some circumstances. So with this information, when you make the training and technical assistance plan in the next year's Model State Plan, you would make adjustments in the new plan under Table 8.1. And depending on how you felt and after looking at this data and the feedback you got, you may decide that you want to set aside more resources or a different amount of resources for on-site technical assistance or smaller cluster trainings, that kind of thing. And at that point, in this new Model State Plan, you will answer for the first time the performance management question under 8.3, and that you would outline the adjustments you made to maybe the smaller cluster groups or those kind of adjustments that you made based on the feedback you got in response to the plan under the previous plan, how you performed, how you administered your training and technical assistance. So I hope that's something of a little bit more of a tangible scenario to see how these kind of performance managements are meant to work in the Model State Plan, simply to have that constant feedback loop about data and constantly having giving the states and all of us an opportunity to improve our performance the next time around. So this is the conclusion for Section 8, and we just have one more long section next, Section 9. So we'll just take a moment we actually will take a minute or so to take a little break, and if you want to look at more closely and think about what questions you have and submit them in the chat, we would appreciate that. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry for that brief pause. I understand we have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you so much. We do have one more section to try to get through, and I'll try to go a little bit more quickly here. And please rest assured we are taking all your questions and appreciate them, and we will address them in the future, if not getting to all of them today. So thank you very much. The final section we're going to cover today is Section 9, State Linkages and Communication. This section starts on page 18 of your Model State Plan document. The purpose of the section is to gather information on linkages at the state level. For example, so one of the first purposes here is to gather information at the state level, and these kinds of state level linkages are things such as linkages with LIHEAP or Head Start or TANF at the state level. Another purpose of this section is to gather information about state level activities to create and support linkages and coordination at the local level between CSBG and other community-based organizations, as well as supporting coordination among the eligible entities themselves. Finally, this section gathers information about the state's communication with the eligible entities, including how the state provides feedback to the eligible entities on performance on the state accountability measures. As you can see, there are several accountability measures in this section, including a measure associated with a performance management question, 7SB. The questions in this section are pretty straightforward and include a customizable table for the state to, in broad strokes, create a communication plan, which is similar to how the state might have created, similar to the table the state will use to create a technical assistance and training plan under Section 8, so it's a little bit familiar here. However, we want to take a minute to talk about our approach to this section and the questions to this section, because similar to the data in the section, as you recall in Section 7, the use of remainder and discretionary funds, the content in this Section 9 does have areas from the former plan. You'll see that there was a lot of overlap and redundancy, and so Section 9 took a little bit of, we wanted to take some time to try to reduce this in the Model State Plan here. Our goal in this section, again, is to have the state only enter data in one place and allow the data to link or pre-populate to other corresponding areas and reduce duplication. Now, just a note here, just as background to this whole section, linkages and partnerships are critical to the work of community action and CSBG, so this section in the Model State Plan is quite important, and we want the Model State Plan to feature the state's plans for playing this primary, this role in both a primary and supporting initiator in creating linkages and partnerships to support CSBG activities and holding it all together with strong communication. So this is a very important section. We hope you'll review it closely, provide feedback. There are two places, moving on to the next slide, where there's really two places where there's overlap in terms of this section, linkages and communication, and other section in the Model State Plan. And the areas of overlap are, one, the use of discretionary remainder funds, and then there's also overlap in the program assurance section. Now, you're probably, I mentioned earlier, you're all familiar with CSBG program assurances. There's a list of items that the state must include in the state plan, as listed under 676B of the Act. Now, in the Model State Plan, as I mentioned earlier, the assurances are all grouped together because it would be more confusing to break them apart. So we do have them all together, and they're in Section 14, and we'll discuss that in the third webinar. However, there is also overlap from those assurances and in other parts of the plan, and we've already talked about the overlap in one of them in terms of discretionary funding. But now we'd like to talk about the overlap with the assurance on linkages. And this is the assurance under 676B5. It's listed here on this slide, so you can take a look at it. And of course, the corresponding element in the assurance section, in Section 14, is item 14.5. This assurance corresponds specifically with the question on state-level linkages described in question 9.1. So I won't read the assurance here, but you can see it on the slide. Now, if you look at the instructions under 9.1, the response here will, the instruction says that the response under 9.1 will link to or pre-populate the response in the corresponding assurance. So again, you will not have to enter the data twice, and the relationship should be clear. You'll enter it here in Section 9, and then when you get to the assurance under Section 14, it will pre-populate or link, and you won't have to enter it again. Similarly, on the next slide here, there is an interaction between the content under Section 9 and the chart on the use of discretionary remainder funds. And as you recall, this chart is a little bit difficult to unpack, and we'll hope you look at it closely. But you remember how we laid out a table where the state indicated the amount, if any, of remainder discretionary funds it plans to use and allocated towards various allowable categories. And then at the far right, the state was to describe in a little bit of detail the actual activities that were going to be done in that area, that activity area. Now, one of the categories, row B under Table 7.10, was for funds used for coordinating, for the coordination of state-operated programs and or local programs. So you will see here in the draft model state plan, this funding category under 7.10B for coordination of state-operated programs or local programs, it crosswalks with questions 9.1 and 9.2 in the linkages section of the model state plan. Because you're answering the questions about activities for coordination of state-operated and local programs in Section 9, you do not have to describe them previously under Section 10 in the table. And if you recall, when we were talking about the table in Section 7, that the area where you would have provided narrative is blocked out and says you don't have to fill in the narrative on the activities because it's going to be later in the plan. So you can see how those interact. Finally, there's a similar interaction between another category, and that's category C on 7.10 of that table on under the allocation of remainder discretionary fund. This category of allowable activity is statewide coordination and communication among eligible entities, and you see that crosswalks with the questions 9.3, 9.4, and 9.5 in the model state plan. And again, because you'll answer the questions in Section 9, you don't have to fill them in under Section 7.10C, but so there, all you would do is put in any funds that you would allocate to that. And there's an interaction there, and hopefully it's represented in the model state plan to avoid duplication. The last three slides today are about the accountability measures in this section. The first measure is 7SA, which is appropriately found under the heading, of course, of linkages and communication under in the accountability measures document. And it reads, during the performance period, the state provided both quantitative data and examples of how the state CSBG office maintained and created linkages within state government to assure the effective delivery of services to low-income people and communities. The measure corresponds with question 9.2 and is about state-level linkages and coordination. We've already been looking at 9.1, which is at state-level linkages and coordination, and with which agencies and states plans to build partnerships. I'm sorry, I have that wrong in my notes. And this corresponds with question 9.1 in the model state plan. So keep in mind, this is about state-level linkages. It's not about linkages that the state would make at the local level or even connecting state and local resources. This is about state-level linkages here. So it only corresponds with 9.1 in the model state plan. This measure, again, is mostly assessed in the annual report when the state will provide information about how the state actually performed, both with data and examples, in creating these state-level linkages. The second accountability measure in this section is 5S(4), which is a measure that falls under the heading of data collection, analysis, and reporting. And it reads, During the performance period, the state submitted to the eligible entities and State Community Action Association information about actual versus planned performance on the state accountability measures within 60 calendar days of getting feedback from OCS. This accountability measure corresponds with question 9.5 on the model state plan, which reads, describe how the state will provide feedback within 60 calendar days to local entities and state community action associations regarding performance on state accountability measures. The reason this accountability measure and corresponding question is included in this section is because it's really about communication, so it falls under this section 9. This is the responsibility of the state to report back to the eligible entities and state community action association regarding performance. So it's this feedback or communication loop that's important here. In the model state plan, question 9.5 simply asks about how the state intends or plans to do this, what the plan is. Then in the annual report, the state will report and tell us whether and how they followed through on providing that feedback, so they will be giving us the actual performance on this. Therefore, this measure is assessed in the annual report. Just one note about this accountability measure. We plan to work with all of you as we all get up to speed in assessing the accountability measures. This measure here is predicated on our processing at OCS and with you and the states and completing an accountability assessment tool and other supports so that we can assess these in a way that's useful for everyone. Until we know more about what all of this looks like, this measure here and how it may work may still seem a little fuzzy to us as we look at it and to you, but we want to rest assured that we will be working on getting up to speed so that we'll have more definitive information about what this is going to look like. We want to work on this together with you so that these accountability measures and the feedback loop it creates and the performance management process it creates is seamless and useful to everybody. I think we might be on our last slide here. This is the final accountability measure in section 9, and it's associated with the 6th performance management question in the model state plan. This is also under the under the heading of state linkages and communication. And it reads, during the performance period, using data from a nationally administered survey of eligible entities and feedback from OCS and other sources, the state adjusted its plan in the next plan as appropriate to improve its communication efforts. Again, this accountability measure is measuring whether the state gathered feedback in the performance area of communications and used that information to improve performance in the next planning cycle and as appropriate. Now, I won't read the performance management question, adjustment question that's in your model state plan under item 9.6, but again, you won't have to answer this question the first time you fill out the model state plan, but the next time you submit the plan, you will. And that gives you a chance to have a year of feedback and think about how you're going to adjust the plan the next time around based on feedback, and you'll have an opportunity to describe what you did and why you did it in the next model state plan. The point of assessment will indeed be in the next model state plan when OCS and the state will be able to look at how how the state may have addressed this accountability measure. So this concludes section 6. And section 9, and I'm going to now hand it over to staff for questions, unless we want to take a break.
We'll take just a brief moment here. We'll be on mute and we'll be coming back on in just about 30 seconds to a minute to begin the Q&A section.
Hi, this is Jovita from NASCAST, and while we're taking a moment to pause before the Q&A period, I did want to share, as we have via the chat feature, that you can find these webinars posted to the NASCAST website. If you look on the left-hand side toolbar, you'll go to CSBG, you're going to go to training guides or guides and manuals, and you'll see a section there on the revised model state plan. You can already find there the webinar recording and webinar PowerPoint from part 1 in this series, and we're going to be posting the part 2 piece from today, tomorrow. So we'll continue to keep that updated and keep you posted. Do want to also note, generally speaking, that the NASCAST website, particularly the CSBG section, has undergone a bit of a revamp, and you can now find all of the Roma Next Generation materials there. We do have some new case studies that are listed there in terms of theory of change and bundled service delivery. So I would encourage folks to take a moment and check those out. As it relates to bundled services, there are 3 case studies of local agencies, and following each case study are resources from those local agencies related to their bundled services or case management delivery system.
Okay, thank you so much, Shavita. We're ready to begin the Q's and A's as time permits here. And as we noted before, this is Seth Hassett. We have some limitations in time. We'll go through as many as we can, and then we have taken copious notes about the questions we received, and I know that NASCAP has as well, and we will be working to assure that we follow up on all the questions that we receive. So I believe, NASCAP, that you were going to, Janae was going to, Jovita was going to share the questions?
Yes, so the first question we have is, who is responsible for determining if a state has met an accountability measure? And what then, if any, are the consequences for not meeting a measure? For example, the model state plan and related measures look at the extent to which eligible entity participation or to which eligible entities are engaged in developing the state plan, and how well the plan reflects their input. Who determines then what extent and how well that has been done? And if not well, is there TNCA? Are there consequences?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. And so this is a system that relies heavily on both increase in transparency and accountability at both the federal and state levels for our critical functions. And in some cases, it relies on multiple data sources sort of to make a determination. As Liza mentioned, one of the steps in this process will be to have assessment tools that will serve as a point of communication between OCS and the states. For most measures, we are obtaining some form of information, or most areas, from 2 sources: the states describing either in the state plans and in the annual reports. In some measures, the outcome will be readily apparent just based on the specific measure of the specific nature of the measure and the target that was set. But let me just make clear that the goal is, and in other measures, there will be perhaps a different, multiple perspectives that will be included in the review. The feedback from the eligible entities themselves, as well as the state's information on their how they've addressed the accountability measure. And this is really not intended to be a punitive system. As I said, it relies on transparency and accountability. It's a point of conversation and a point for us to look at both at our governmental levels as accountable government agencies at how we can do the best job possible in meeting the mission and purpose of the Act. OCS will provide feedback based on information from state plans, but states will also be, again, primarily as a governmental entity, accountable based on their own system and relationship with the entities. So this will be a conversation. There will be tools developed. They will not be. This is where, again, the emphasis throughout this system is standards and accountability at each level with high levels of transparency, and a system that's designed to make the information apparent to everybody. Sometimes there's a sort of a process where if we ask the question, that makes sure that we're paying it. It's obviously of importance and is getting attention in all of our systems. So this will be an ongoing conversation, and I guess the main point of emphasis is we're not seeking to develop when this conversation about consequences, a punitive system. We're seeking to develop a performance-oriented system and a performance management system in which there's a feedback loop and a continuous improvement effort.
Thanks, Seth. Our next question is for 6.7. Is there a reason that it was kind of skipped in the first year in terms of targeting? Wouldn't states set a target from the first year onward for 6.7?
Now, I believe 6.7 is related to the organizational standards, and for a number of these measures, the general idea is that during the first year, we have to establish some form of baseline before we would begin to set targets in order to understand what we expect to achieve as far as entities meeting the standards. We need to start with a preliminary understanding of where we're beginning. Again, this is we're not looking for we don't think we'll have very reliable targets if we don't have some form of baseline and some initial round of looking at how we're doing and meeting the standards. So that's the general idea, and that is why on a number of these measures there might not be a target in the first year, but there would be follow-up of that nature.
Okay, our next question is, what does OCS consider state authority, or is that been determined by the states themselves?
Well, I think that this question, has to do with perhaps on the realm of organizational standards, what are the state's authorities? We have discussed this pretty extensively in IM 138, and we talk about the fact that states certainly need to review their own rulemaking, contracting procedures. What does it take to make standards official in a state system? But as outlined in IM 138, the CSBG Act certainly outlines both the state authority and the responsibility to develop and utilize standards and requirements in the oversight of the CSBG funds. This is an area, again, under the block grant structure where states have their differing systems, differing processes, rules, and rulemaking systems. But in general, that, again, I'd certainly encourage review of IM 138 because the language there is very intentional around looking at encouraging the state to go through a process of reviewing its own authorities, involving leadership council, and again, consultation with different parties in how to appropriately establish and make official the standards. And that's what my assumption is that question is related to, but if not, we will take a follow-up in writing and try to clarify.
Thanks. It looks like this next question might be around reporting on use of funds in one way or another. The question is, what about when one funded activity would meet one or more than one category?
And I believe this relates to the technical, the state use of funds category, where there are a series of categories, and it's an excellent question in the fact that, in some cases, states may well have an activity that has an element of technical assistance, has an element of innovative programming, and et cetera. So just to start out with, just to outline, the categories that we used were the categories that are outlined in the CSBG Act. So that sort of is a starting point in terms of why those particular categories were identified. We're trying to stick to the statute and to the as much as possible. A couple of thoughts around this. One, as a general rule, we would ask states to review and make a determination as to the primary purpose. Again, in some cases, a monitoring effort may have a follow-up technical assistance element. And again, sometimes that's a part of a well-designed program and system. However, we're also going to we'll take note of this question and would take note of comments in the comment period about how this can be most effectively done. One thought would be to have a multi-use section, or and I believe we do have other opportunities to describe something that does not fit within the standard categories. But again, the first thinking on this is these were categories outlined in the kinds of uses that the CSBG Act outlines for the potential uses of these funds, and but as we would start with a first determination, and we can put some further guidance and thinking into this about the primary purpose, and then perhaps how to look at if it has, other related activities.
And then speaking of the CSBG Act, does OCS believe the list in Section 675C(b)(1) to be in order of preference?
No, I think we don't. I think, and I'm going to ask other staff to jump in if they have it. But our understanding is these are presented essentially in the order that they were in the Act, and there's no preference. I mean, I will say that it's always a good thing, and I would encourage, if you are looking at state discretionary use of funds, and this has always been illuminating for me, to read through the Act in terms of what the CSBG Act really spells out and intends in terms of the use of the remainder funds. There are some clear goals with regard to it, all of which is to support the purpose and mission of the CSBG Act. Most of the uses that are outlined focus on strengthening and supporting the network of entities that are funded through the Act. There are other potential uses, and we don't make a judgment as to the precedence of those, but what we do want to make sure is that in planning for the use of those funds, that states are planful, and with regard to what the Act sort of outlines as potential uses, that these are the resources that are available to make sure that your state networks are as strong, responsive, accountable as possible. And so we are, I think, asking for, that this process be grounded in what the CSBG Act spells out in terms of the purposes and uses of those funds. But as far as do we have a judgment as to which ones are more important than others, or an order of precedence, we don't.
Okay. The next question goes back to our discussion on reporting around use of funds, and it states, if a state opts not to use discretionary funds and pass through 95% of its allocation, how should they report that?
We do know that there are some states that pass through 95% that do not retain remainder funds, and I think that would simply have to be reported as zero in the table with, non-narrative. There may be, and again, looking for sections, there are places where we describe activities and technical assistance, perhaps, but as far as expenditure of dollars, or the planned expenditure, it would be a zero. And we do know that, again, in some cases there are state laws that require that pass-through. So that's not the majority of states, but in those states that would be how it would need to be presented clearly. And we will look to make sure that the table does make that option clear.
And I believe our third to last question that we're winding down in terms of time, but do have 3 more. The first of those is, as it relates to the surveys that will take place. So oftentimes states fund more than eligible entities with their discretionary funds. So they, though, will be the only ones considered for providing feedback around the use of discretionary funds. Is that the case, or is it open for discussion? Or?
So at this point, we don't have a plan to survey other entities that receive the discretionary funds. You know, I will say that from a first, and I think there was more. The question also had some at least looking at on the chat pool, that there was a question as to you know, if the entity's perspective was that a larger share of the funds in the discretionary pot should be going to them as opposed to other entities, how, you know, how would that be addressed? And the central point is, first, the idea of surveying entities is not really limited to the use of these funds. It's related to a broad array of accountability functions, communications, and the perspective of the entities. And again, the questions that we'll be using, the very specific questions, have not yet been formulated and are going to be formulated by a work group that involves states. What I will say, though, is that from an accountability perspective, given that at least 90% of the funds do pass through the entities, and we do want to have an input loop on whether and how the discretionary funds are being used, and are they being used in a manner that contributes to the purposes of the CSBG Act and the strength of the network. We know there will be differing perspectives on that. From a compliance perspective, the only issue is that the funds are allowable uses, but from a accountability loop and feedback and making sure that funds are used most effectively, again, we have that question. That's a question that we would hold ourselves to in federal surveys and be putting out, and is also one that we would include, you know, feedback from the network. It does not, again, it doesn't. It just means that it's an opportunity for information and conversation about the most effective use of those funds.
So speaking once more to a very specific section, going back to section 8.1, might it be possible for there to be more than one drop-down option per quarter, or a no response option?
I think we're going to, I'm seeing a lot of nodding yes heads. So,
you can
go ahead.
Go ahead, Moni.
Yeah.
You can do more than one thing per quarter, but there shouldn't be no response. But we can go further into that when we do trainings.
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of the challenges, I think, as I said yesterday, for everybody looking at these things is you're not necessarily you're seeing an outline, and that's, of course, done because we have, for a lot of good reasons, we don't want to invest in putting all the programming into this before we've gotten feedback that we've got the questions in a reasonable way. But in these sections, I think what we are hearing is that, yes, there can be more than one drop-down response per quarter, and we'll have to look at the no response, how that would be handled. Okay, where are we on the next, what next question?
The final two, I'll just give them to you together. The first is, how does the technical assistance plan differ from the QIP, or the quality improvement plan? And then the final question is just about technical assistance training that OCS might be providing in the future to help states to respond effectively to the revised model state plan.
Okay, well, thanks. So in item 138, we did use the term technical assistance plan, and we are making reference and have been looking at, one of the things we want to be clear is a quality improvement plan is a term from the CSBG Act. It's based on deficiencies that must be corrected and could result in potential reduction or termination of funds if not corrected. There's a process that is outlined there, and it is it's a process that has significance in terms of the potential funding implications. The thought is that there are items that could be identified in review of standards or that need to be addressed or but are not determined to be at the level of a potential termination for cause, or certainly not in the first round of input. In other words, if you've got a couple of items that are noted and the state has developed procedures and communicates a technical assistance plan, then that would be a distinction we would want to make. What we're trying to make sure is we know that there is the term QIP and the quality improvement plan, again, denotes a deficiency that is may result in potential reduction or termination if not corrected based in a specific time frame. And the second question had to do with what additional technical assistance is anticipated. This is just the beginning. We know that, and in some, we expect the effort to be intensive and ongoing. Again, we've made numerous references to the NASCAP conference, but in part, we expect to have a lot of discussion there about our plan of technical assistance, how to work with states. There are a number of things that we anticipate on the table. I mean, ultimately, when we have this system developed, we will have, there will be training on the finalized OLDC system, which will be, provided specific to logging in, going through the system. We know that many states have gotten the first round of experience doing that with the SF 424M this year, but there will be that type of training. But one of the things part of our consultation with at NASCAP and discussion is about other ways that we can facilitate support and also work with states around planning efforts and even state-to-state information sharing about how states are planning to operationalize or handle issues like the hearings and public review of the plans. So the short answer is this is the beginning of a lot more intensive work that we know is ahead over the next several months. Step one is for you to have really looked through the plan as the document, that's the comment document, and make sure you have a good understanding of it. Going through these webinars is one step, giving us the feedback. And again, at NASCAP, that's one of the places we will be discussing our ongoing plan of TA. So I think that, again, this is webinar number 2 of a planned 3. We do have another one, and I think there were, again, we will take note of any other questions that we have, and we will either attempt to address them right at the beginning of the third webinar or find the right opportunity to do that. Thank you, everyone, for the thoughtful questions, for being with us. And I know we're taking a lot of time to do this, but we think it's going to pay dividends in the end because it will help us further down the line. So thank you also to NASCAP for your for hosting this and for helping us with the questions and the follow-up. Please do, again, remind you, we did talk about this at the last session, but the Dear Colleague letter that went out with the model state plan, gave instructions for how to submit comments on the federal, related to the Federal Register notice and the OMB clearance process. And even if you've raised the question here, if we've answered it and you're satisfied, you know, that's wonderful. If you feel like there's some real positive things to share about where things are going, that's also great. But if there are questions that you've asked and you want to make sure that they're, you know, on record, do make sure you put them into that system, because that's the you know, gives us one repository to respond to. So thanks again, everyone, and I guess we will sign off on our end, and we will look forward to talking to folks next week.